we want to have a frank conversation about how realistic this vision is, what impact it would have on our economy if he were to practicalize these proposals, and whether indeed there is the ability to do so in an IMF program. Godfred Bokpin is a professor of finance and an economist, at the University of Ghana. He joins us via phone. Also on the phone is Gilbert Yirenkyi Addo. He's a senior manager of business tax at Deloitte Ghana. Good morning to you both. Thank you for your time with us.
Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Kojo.
And good morning, Kojo, and good morning to your listeners.
Indeed. It's a great pleasure to have you both. There's a lot to talk about. I want to get started. Prof. Bokpin, generally, the idea that the Vice President is proposing is to broaden the tax net. He says that now that digitalization has made strides, it is now possible for more people to pay tax. But in his case, more people to pay fewer taxes. How will that affect revenue? And is it a practical idea?
I think overall it's consistent with sound tax policy. Also, from a more theoretical perspective, we have been talking about this many times, and I associate with the position that the Vice President or the flag bearer of the party had adduced. There's one thing talking about it this way, and then there's another level implementing it efficiently. So let's talk about the conceptualization. We had maintained that e-levy is inappropriate, and I'm happy the Vice President made a bold statement that this has to be abolished. It is my considered view that any government from 2025 should not think twice about abolishing the e-levy. And that would not be adversarial to our tax objectives under the IMF supported program. My understanding is that if the IMF itself had its own way, they would have asked government to abolish the e-levy. Probably, the government would have told the IMF that they should be given a little bit more time to see how the tax handle will perform before probably it is reviewed or abolished. So certainly, we need to oil the digital economy and promote cashless economy. That is the way to go. Because the understanding, both from theoretical perspective and practice, is that the digital economy is expected to grow faster than the traditional economy. Once that is the direction, you don't impose a tax handle as an inhibiting force and rather punish people to use the channel that is most efficient. You don't do that. It's a very backward way of implementing a tax policy. So that I think, and I believe that any of the candidates vying for our vote in 2024 should certainly do that. The other bit also is about the use of the Ghana card. You will see that a lot of progress has been made, as the Vice President acknowledged. But, Jansen, we have not been able to leverage on that huge jump in terms of the number of Ghanaians who have Ghana card, enroping them into the tax bracket up to date. So there's a huge gap, and that raises questions as to whether we'll be able to scale up tax revenue merely on the basis that every Ghanaian has a Ghana card. There is a lot of work that has to be done. And I certainly agree. If you look at the tax-paying population, even if you estimate that from the labor force, you are looking at something in excess of 13 million. Less than 5 million people pay direct income taxes. The emphasis here is on direct income tax, what we call payee. But the burden of the tax that Ghanaians are complaining is not so much from the direct tax handles. It's more from the consumption-based taxes, indirect taxes. So when it comes to indirect taxes, almost a lot of Ghanaians are paying. VAT and all of that, a lot of Ghanaians are paying. It's the direct income tax. Then when it comes to the direct income tax, you will see that the more formalized the sector or the economy is, the more you are able to collect direct income tax. So, for instance, if you look at the subsectors of our economy, the mining sector, mining and quarrying, is more or less the highest tax-paying subsector because of how formalized it is. But then when it comes to the illegal mining aspect of that value chain, we are not making any progress. A huge loss to the state. But then again, when it comes to the financial and insurance subsector, because of how formalized it is, even though in terms of job creation potential is limited, its tax contribution to our overall tax revenue is very high. Now, but because of the huge informal sector of our economy, when it comes to construction, other subsectors that are a bit more labor intensive, because of the informality, we are not getting as much as we should. So overall, it points out to a good direction. But the issue is the average Ghanaian politician is very humble, and we are efficient when we are in opposition. You can see that same poster from the Vice President's presentation. He's speaking from an opposition. That's Ghana's basic problem.
Well,
so
he's in
can
government.
associate many of these things with some of his presentations when he was in opposition.
Well, he's in government
Clearly.
now, so can it not be argued that he actually knows what it would take to do these things and whether or not they can be done, since he's currently part of the government?
Yes. It has taken them too long to actually put to practice many of these things he told us in February 2024. In as much as I acknowledge that he is not the driver and he is the mate, you can see clearly from the presentation that the mate was eager to take credit collectively where there is success and to dissociate himself where there is weakness or failure. I think that overall, the MPP government represented our hope for economic transformation from 2016. And I think a certain level of admission and humility and apology to Ghanaians will help the MPP and will help all of us. The reason I'm saying so is that, Kojo, the level of resources, tax revenue that the MPP government had the privilege of presiding over from 2017 to 2024, no government has had that. No government has had that. In oil, both in volume and price, tax revenue, come on. Okay, so if you look at the amount of resources and the level of borrowing that this government has done, no other government has done that. And if you look at the future, it's going to be difficult for any government to have that kind of privilege and resources and the support from the citizens that this government had since 2017. So overall, I get a certain sense also, and it's not peculiar to only the vice president. If you look at the discussion from all the candidates that are putting themselves forward for our vote, from the NDC, MPP, there's one butterfly, and then all the others. There's a certain sense that they appreciate that the Ghanaians are growing or are becoming more dissatisfied with our democracy and our governance, especially from expenditure management. I'm excited. The president spoke about the fact that the number of his ministers, deputies, and all of that will not be more than 50. I would even prefer that it's not more than 40. You also get a certain sense from the NDC that they are also thinking about cutting down on the size of government. And all of them, their benchmark is the current size of this government. That is the benchmark.
Yeah.
Again, if you see from all of them, and for me, that is what gives me hope that it is possible to save our democracy from itself and make democracy work for the ordinary Ghanaian. That is the direction that we should be looking at it, or I'm looking at it from.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of taxation, this government has abused the concept of taxation. Unfortunately, we never had opportunity of listening to the vice president when all these tax policies from COVID were being implemented and thrown at us until February 2024. So I of course, I also respect him for taking that bold decision, okay, to prefer a different direction from what probably he has been part of.
Right.
That is good news.
Okay.
From expenditure side, okay.
If you don't mind, we'll come to the expenditure side, but I want to bring in Mr. Yirenkyi Addo, and let's look at the effect of this on businesses. Okay, there's a tax amnesty being proposed. So for a certain period of time, those who have not been regularizing themselves in terms of tax will be given a chance to start afresh. There's going to be flat taxes all around for individuals, SMEs. They're going to simplify the corporate tax system. Again, when you go to the ports, we're going to be pegged to Lomé. Never will our duties exceed those of Lomé. Spare parts are going to be imported at a flat rate per container, depending on the size of the container. Let's talk about how some of these policies would affect businesses, the private sector in Ghana.
Okay, so thank you very much, Kojo. I think that Prof has touched on some critical issues, which I'll also leverage on to also share our perspective. I think that when it comes to broadening the tax net, this in terms of direct taxes, I think that when the Income Tax Act was passed, when you look at the second schedule, there was that policy narrative of a modified taxation system. If you look at the second schedule, and that re-echoed some of the principles that are being espoused by the vice president. The question for us as tax experts is, how has this been implemented? Because when you look at that particular principle, it seeks to address the simplification of the direct tax system for some categories of taxpayers.
Yeah.
And it would have also roped in or helped to manage the taxation of the informal sector. Of course, one challenge we've always had, and as Prof alluded to, is to come out with policies. But then the question is, some of these policies, what analysis have we done to assess how much revenue have come in? What cost-benefit analysis have we done? Of course, most of this information may be there, but it's not within the public domain. So if you seek to, grant tax amnesty. I mean, I think somewhere last year, government gave this tax amnesty, and I think that the Revenue Authority had a substantial amount of revenue from that. But on the hindsight, the waivers that we give in terms of the interest and the penalties are cost to government. So you need to do the debit and the credit. In as much as you have raised insufficient revenue, have you just opposed it with the cost? And what is the cost? It is the penalties and the interest that we've waived off. And some of them were very material. So in as much as it will be good for tax compliance, it will be good for expanding the scope, theoretically, because practically there is still that gap that has not been worked on.
There are several individuals and businesses who escape the tax net, if you will. They find whatever opportunity not to pay tax. Will the Vice President's proposals actually deal with that? This idea of an amnesty, this idea of using digitalization to identify every taxable, citizen, every commercial citizen, every business individual, and so forth. Will these things actually solve the problem of people, businesses especially, avoiding paying the proper taxes?
Great. So, for instance, if we look at the digitization drive, that to a large extent will help us reasonably manage, not to entirely extinguish the problem. It will help us manage. Our problem as a country is what I call the incubation period. Having the time when we bring on board the policies to do proper data analysis and proper tracking up until we hit a point where we know that, okay, we have gotten this number of people into the bracket. Before the implementation of this policy, maybe we had only 10%. So when you are to do that, you don't focus on immediately bringing in tax revenue. But the problem is you also need a revenue to do government business. So that is the disconnect. But if we were able to focus on other areas of revenue mobilization, other than overly focusing on tax, we could have some time to then do that work, make sure that through the digitization process, a lot of people have come into the tax net. There is proper synchronization of systems. Because we have different regulatory bodies managing Ghana card, this is managing this. Proper synchronization. The systems are talking to each other. Once you're able to do that, then we'll be able to possibly extinguish that problem. Because there are systems in place to get you into the net. Immediately you hit a certain threshold. You don't need to be perceived. But we need to focus on other areas of revenue mobilization. Let me give you this example. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, I once heard on radio on BBC that, okay, fine, they don't intend to increase taxes, but they need to raise revenue to address or do government business. So what have they decided to do? To increase visa fees. Of course, every ordinary Ghanaian may want to go to the United Kingdom, and I use my word advisedly, may. But the quantum of people that want to go there globally is more. So they focus on other areas of raising revenue. And we can also do that. What are the other areas of raising revenue? The municipal assemblies, some of the things they do, how are we monitoring that? What are the systems in place? So the digitization will then look at all those areas comprehensively And we need to have time for that. I have always said that when you go to some of the municipal assemblies, they have halls that they rent out. That is not their core business. People come to rent those places for weddings and other social events. That is not their core business. And that activity requires that they charge VAT. Because there are no proper systems, the money does not even go into the coffers of government. People will go and hire heavy duty equipment to go and grade their lands and all those things. Those are all revenue sources. So if we could then expand the digitization drive to those areas and have proper controls in place, you realize that reasonably we could then meet each other halfway. There could be some substantial revenue from those non-tax handles rather than focusing on businesses. So that is the position on the digitization drive. For the exemption, of course, it's going to be good because they've done that exercise before. Possibly there are reports to do the cost-benefit analysis. From where the vice president sits, he may have seen the report and would, based on that, think that reintroducing that would enhance voluntary compliance. That could be good, but that should not be the only mechanism, because as I said, we need to look at the cost. And what is the cost? Is the interest and the penalty that we are waiving off, which is also revenue. So if, let's say, you rake in 100 billion in terms of revenue, and you are writing off, let's say, 70 billion, in the end, what have you achieved? So those cost-benefit analysis is very critical for some of these policies to yield a required return. Is very important. And that could also give business that respite, because there is data to support whatever you are doing.
I want to say a big, well, actually stay with us because we're not done. We're talking to Professor Godfred Bokpin and Mr. Gilbert Yirenkyi Addo. Professor Bokpin, of course, Professor of Finance and Economist at University of Ghana, Legon, and Mr. Yirenkyi Addo, Senior Manager of Business Tax at Deloitte Ghana. We're learning so much as we assess the Vice President's tax policies as communicated in his address last week. Now, when we come back, we've talked about the theory. Both of our guests consider the theory to be sound. But now we're going to talk about the practical aspect of it. How far does this stray from our own medium-term revenue plans? But more importantly, will our IMF program actually permit such a diversion from our revenue-heavy recovery program? Let's get back to our conversation. Professor Bokpin and Mr. Yirenkyi Addo, Mr. Gilbert Yirenkyi Addo, are our guests. And before the break, I think both guests confirmed or agreed that in theory, the direction that the Vice President seeks to take with taxation is sound. But now we have to assess the practicality of it. And Prof. Bokpin, I'd like to start with you. We're in an IMF program. This program is heavily predicated on revenue collection. The Vice President wants to make radical changes to revenue collection, including abolishing several taxes. How will this affect our agreement with the Bretton Woods institution? And will we still be able to meet the targets that we've set for ourselves to get out of this program?
Yes, it is possible. Typically, the IMF will not impose a tax handle on a nation or decide that remove this one or maybe introduce this one. They can advise. But what they are interested in is the broader framework of your fiscal goal, proxied by your fiscal balance or your primary balance. So once they set the target, it is then up to the country to decide the specific strategies or tax handles that they want to deploy to achieve that. So there is room to accommodate some of these proposals. And it's the same way that any of the serious political parties, as they craft their manifestos, their promises, they will have to look at it within that framework. So it is possible. So for instance, if you are supposed to increase your tax to GDP ratio or your revenue broadly to GDP to, let's say, about 18%, and you decide that I'm going to abolish e-levy because this is how much e-levy is bringing. But once I abolish this, I create a gap or a deficit. But this is how I will close the deficit. I'm going to immediately improve through administrative reforms and greater compliance and increase the efficiency level of VAT from, let's say, 44%, let's say about 60% within this year. And you demonstrate how you are going to do it. You arrive at the same goal. And Yankson, this can be done. I'll just give you two examples. And I think Mr. Yirenkyi Addo mentioned that I agree with him totally. If you pick just VAT, it's a good tax handle. The inefficiency in our VAT system is more than 54%. That is VAT alone. So what that means is that if you look at the VAT potential, the revenue the VAT is supposed to bring in, we are operating suboptimally. To close that, Yankson, you don't even increase the VAT rate. It's more of compliance and administrative reforms to make sure that the VAT as a tax handle works the way it's supposed to. How do you do that? And I'm sure the Vice President will have to tell us how they will navigate their way through the political economy, the politically connected transactions along the ports, which also manifest in exemptions. Okay, huge exemptions which affect the ability of Ghana Revenue Authority to realize the tax potential from some of these tax handles.
Now, Prof. Bokpin,
you know how much we are losing through exemptions?
Tell us.
Okay, we are losing hugely. In fact, we are losing more than 3% of our GDP to exemptions alone.
Okay.
And I've said this time and again, 2019, you go and check the State of the Nation address that our president gave. Our president was very clear that the biggest threat to Ghana's tax revenue is exemption. Is exemptions.
Now,
and that if we don't do anything about it, in the next 10 years or so, more than half of Ghana's revenue will be lost to exemptions.
You've asked a question. You've asked a question about the Vice President telling us how we deal with this. So if you look at his vision statement, he's talked about a flat rate income tax, for instance. And you've talked about how much is lost by way of, VAT that is not collected. We also know that about 81%, there's a gap of 81% in income tax that is not collected. So just about 19% will pay income tax, particularly of companies. Now he's talked about having a flat rate, and this he believes is the way to go in ensuring compliance. Do you agree that having a flat rate as a percentage of income is the way to go?
Look, the reason is not because the existing tax is so complex and difficult to comprehend. I'm not too sure that is where the problem is coming from. Yes, there's conventional wisdom in simplifying it, flat VAT rate and the rest of them. But I think the issues are much more broader than that. We can give the Vice President the benefit of the doubt. Probably the details will come out on how all of these things will be operationalized. But I think it looks too simplistic to assume that by introducing the flat VAT rate or rate, is what will solve the problem. I don't think that's too simplistic, and I think that's where the surprise will come from. Okay. I think that I will lean towards what Mr. Gilbert talked about, that there has to be a detailed cost-benefit analysis. And many of these proposals have to be informed by some detailed analysis, diagnostic tests, fiscal capacity analysis, some stochastic frontier analysis that determines across all the tax handles the efficient way of deploying them. I think that will work. This looks a bit more simplistic for now. That is what I would say. Of course, we can give him the benefit of the doubt. But look at corporate income tax. The inefficiency there is more than 80%.
Exactly. I mean, 81%. And that's what I was making reference to. But let me bring Gilbert in at this point. Gilbert, so if you look at the Vice President's vision, he's talked about abolishing betting tax and all. If you look at our medium-term revenue plan strategy, we actually indicate that earnings from these betting, electronic games and all of that, should be taxed. Now, what do you make of the Vice President's vision, comparing it to our medium-term revenue strategy? Hello, Gilbert. Gilbert, do we still have Gilbert Yirenkyi Addo on the line? Okay, I think we don't have Gilbert Yirenkyi Addo. So I'd ask you that question, Professor Bokpin, because now we're looking at our medium-term revenue strategy, and some of the promises of the Vice President is at variance with, the medium-term revenue strategy. What do you make of that?
Oh, that can be amended. It's a strategy. It can be revised. It can be evaluated. 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, any of the political parties should be bold enough to look at the most efficient way of raising tax revenue without compromising the competitiveness of our private sector and impairing the balance sheet of households. Yeah, so that can, I think it comes down to looking at it broadly, right, and not asking like a tickling policy to respond to public sentiment and the rest of them because of the situation. Of course, you should just understand that this is clearly a situation or an issue created by the government that the same government seeks to respond to come to or to continue in power. Okay, so we have to look at it broadly, and it has to be backed by proper analysis. I mean, it's an industry that is booming. We have to look at it broadly within the concept of the same digitalization, e-commerce, digital trade, and the rest of them. And then, Youngster, let me say this. One issue somebody could pick from all our digitization agenda and Ghana card is we are looking at it more from taxation perspective of raising more revenue. I think digitization brings in much more than just raising more revenue, and the Ghana card has more benefit than just raking in more revenue. So I think we should look at it from a business perspective, and we should look at it as an integral part of our overall economic strategy, which can bring in tax revenue and help make expenditure efficient and help reduce costs and make life user-friendly for every Ghanaian and businesses. I think that way it will help all of us. What you see from the Vice President and pronouncement from other candidates is the fact that there is room for improvement.
Let me bring in Gilbert Yirenkyi Addo again. Gilbert, thank you for joining us once again.
Great.
And I'm asking you the question about the flat income tax rate. First of all, what's your take on it? And what do you also make of the decision, for instance, to abolish certain tax policies which are part of our medium-term revenue strategy? For instance, betting, tax on betting.
Okay, so hello, I hope I can be heard.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So when it comes to, trying to reduce the tax rate or having a simplified system of filing income tax return, I have indicated that this is not new in law. I mean, the medium-term strategy sought to re-emphasize something that is already captured in the second schedule of our Income Tax Act at 896. And the subject matter there is modified taxation, where we have the principles of modified taxation as well as the presumptive taxation. The over-anchoring objective of these two provisions is to address what has already been espoused. So it's not new in law. The question is, how has it been operationalized? So I don't think that it's something that is necessarily new. I have my tax act in front of me, and what I've captured in there is, will modified taxation be the key to expanding the tax bracket? When is it going to be implemented? So I think that we have to go back to the drawing board and look at the reasons for or the challenges that is being encountered in terms of its implementation. When we're able to do this and create a system where it is easy for people to understand the tax handles and be able to file, it will then increase the level of compliance within the economy, which is very important. The expansion or bringing in the informal sector, and most of the times our engagement with them, is the ability to understand the mechanism for filing. So if we are able to make it a bit basic and put other systems in place reasonably, and I always say reasonably, having in mind the nature of our economy, the kind of businesses we have, and sometimes the penchant for not even wanting to pay taxes, even for those who are in the formal sector. So It's very important. This is not new, in my opinion.
And talking about... Yes, but Gilbert, talking about a flat rate, for instance.
Yes.
The question arises, what happens to the principle of ability to pay, equity in taxation?
Good. I think that the flat rate makes equity in taxation well entrenched. Unfortunately, maybe you may not have seen the session I'm making reference, because it also makes reference to some revenue thresholds that will serve as a cardinal point to determine the rate that will be applicable in terms of the taxes that you will pay. Now, before you get to that point, you should have done your analysis well. So I do not see a challenge with the flat rate. If we have done proper work, there is data, and I have not researched to confirm that, so let me presume there is data. What we make out of the data is the data and the science backing the flat rate, and that's what Prof alluded to, that we have the theory and the practical. On paper, theoretically, it's good. But practically, what have we done to ensure that it will yield the required benefit? So, Winston, the issue of flat rate is not a problem. It's the data and the science backing that decision that will require some interrogation for us to assess the practicality of the measure that is being proposed by the Vice President.
Yes, but Gilbert, so I mean, the Vice President talks about assessing businesses. He realizes that there are a lot more SMEs, over 90% SMEs, so you will have a flat rate income tax. But some of these SMEs, if we were to do an assessment of them, would realize that their incomes would differ. And so having a flat rate, and you've talked about the practicality, practically having one rate, how feasible is it? And doesn't it defeat the progressive nature of taxation itself?
So Winston, if you look at my submission, I did indicate that before you even talk about flat rate, you need to then bring on board the threshold on which the flat rate would be proposed. If you look at the presumptive taxation principle, there's a threshold that defines the tax that has to be paid. So you don't just omnibussly say, okay, there's a flat rate, and that's why I agree with you. Everybody is going to pay tax at a flat rate. You need to look at the stream of activities of the various kind of businesses within the Ghanaian economy. What are the volume of activities? What are the costs? Because for direct taxes, the tax will be triggered from the net position. When I say the net position, of course, we are going to look at the person's revenue vis-a-vis the person's cost, holding all things constant on the presumption that costs are legitimate expenses. It could lead to you paying lower taxes or higher taxes, but that is premised on the net position when it comes to direct tax. So before we even think of flat rates, what is the data and science backing it? And that would then cure the doubt that may linger on your mind as well as other listeners. If we have the science and the data, we talk for the manufacturing sector, these are the categorization, these are the figures. When we do this flat rate, this is what will happen. When you go to the extractive industry, for assumption purposes, what is the data and science there? If you go to the service industry, what is the data and science there? Once we have that compact report, if you want to say flat rate, it will be applauded. Of course, once there is data which makes sense, then we know that we cannot derive the right revenue by looking at this policy. So my position is that what is the data and science backing the flat rate? And that's why I said it is one thing making that proposition theoretically, but per the practice, what does it seek to communicate?
That's a profound question on which we can wrap our conversation. I want to say a big thank you to both of our guests. Gilbert Yirenkyi Addo is the last person you heard speaking. He's a senior manager of business tax at Deloitte Ghana. Before him, you heard from Professor Godfred Bokpin. He's a professor of finance and an economist at the University of Ghana. I thank you both for joining us this morning on the show.
Thank you. Have a blessed day.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right, bless you both.